Hello, good morning. Thanks everyone for coming out, stumbling out through your terrible hangovers at the crack of 10. I'm to remind you to silence your cell phones and to fill out your evaluations and all that stuff, so I've done that now. My name is Damian Isla. I have been working in games for a while now. I come from sort of the AAA space. I worked on a couple of the Halo games, spent some time on Destiny, a little time on BioShock Infinite. But for the past couple of years, I've been doing the indie thing, and most recently with my new company, the Molasses flood. And in fact, we describe ourselves as a company of AAA refugees. So a good number of us, all of us came from bigger games, including a lot of us from Irrational post-closure. So we formed this company recently. We just released a game called The Flame and the Flood about 3 weeks ago. So I think for a lot of indies, the notion of procedural content is pretty attractive. It's a neat idea, and especially for us coming from these larger games with very expansive worlds, the thought of having some kind of technology that can sort of amplify our very sort of meager art production budget and expand that into larger worlds and make it look good and immersive and all that stuff, that's a very attractive thought. So I'm going to talk about the river, which turns out to be sort of the central element almost of the game. So the game is a third-person survival roguelike, except instead of crawling through a dungeon, you are taking a long, soulful river journey through a post-societal American South. So, you know, think maybe Don't Starve meets Journey. That's our indie pitch. If you're more literary, more inclined towards the literary, maybe Huckleberry Finn meets The Road, or a retro game pitch, Oregon Trail meets Tubin. Tubin is before even my time, so I had no idea. I don't get that reference myself. And here's how it works. As you float down the river, you come upon large clusters of islands. Among those islands are certain locations you can dock at and get off on foot. So then there's sort of an on-foot exploration mode, and you scrounge for survival materials and hopefully avoid the ravenous wildlife, and then you hop back on your raft and down the river you go. So just to give you a quick look at, this is not the greatest intro to the river, but you know, at least it'll give you a little bit of an idea of what it looks like. Do we have audio? So that's a very small slice, but at least you know at a high level what the river looks like. What really excited me about this project when we first started talking about it was that the river is really, I mean, it is procedurally generated, but is like the central character of the game. It controls a lot of the ebb and flow of the gameplay, and it does so at many different time scales. I mean, that's one of the things that I find really interesting about it. It controls sort of the hour-to-hour player experience in the transition between different biomes and, you know, gradually dwindling resources available to you at the dockable locations. It provides a lot of interesting minute-to-minute decisions for the players. They come into a new island cluster and are forced to make hard decisions between what kind of location which location am I going to hit? Am I going to hit the church where I get certain resources? I'm going to hit the gas station where I get other kinds of resources. And I can't hit both because the river is carrying me forward at all times. So that kind of sort of reactive minute-to-minute decision-making. And then right down to sort of the more arcade-style gameplay of I have to like shoot these rapids, avoid obstacles, and make it out without breaking my bones. So we're gonna talk about all of that and all of those different timescales. But I'll also tell you one big constraint that we faced, which is that our art director, the brilliant Scott Sinclair, is incredibly picky. In fact, he stated straight up at the beginning of the project that he wanted personal control over every single vertex and every single texture. So, you know, he is an extremely sort of detail-oriented artist. He wants to control everything about the lighting and all of that. So for us, some of the sort of maybe expected procedural techniques at the sort of geometric and textural level, we're just not going to do. So most of our techniques are going to involve the arrangement of pre-made pieces. So the big exception to that, of course, is the water rendering, which will be generated based on the fluid flow. But it's a big constraint. But you know, I also think it's probably a constraint that a lot of you face as well, because a lot of you probably work at places where artists are very used to controlling very specifically, you know, what the player sees. So I'm going to give you the 30,000-foot view. This is essentially sort of the staged process by which we generate the entire river. We start with layout, which kind of represents a high-level plan. We go on to composition, in which we decide what elements to place in a particular section of the river. Optimization, which basically arranges the elements in a pleasing way. Flow generation, which represents a very simple fluid dynamics. I won't even call it a simulation. I'll call it a fluid dynamics approximation or something. And then finally, decoration and rendering, in which all of those elements are sort of, you know, a visual pass on them is performed in preparation for presentation to the player. Now, my assumption, by the way, is not that everyone's going to go and like make a river game from this. I'm going to try as much as possible to sort of present the sort of algorithms and techniques we use as fairly general, because I think they are fairly general. And whether you're making procedural cities or procedural solar systems or any of that stuff, I think hopefully you'll find some of these things are pretty relevant to you. The other thing I should mention, or I should mention right now, is that a lot of this work is also the work of my good friend and colleague, Bryn Bennett, particularly the layout stage and the decoration and rendering stage. He's one of my co-founders, the other engineer on the project. So just the two of us on the engineering side. So let's start with layout. So the layout is just basically establishes the high-level shape of the river. In our world, the river sort of consists of a sequence of biomes: wilderness leading into small town, leading into wasteland, et cetera. And then a biome itself is broken up into a series of what we call river sections, which are really just bounding boxes with certain information attached to them. So that's what that image is what the layout looks like. So the layout is, I mean, another way you could think of it is as a script, which is authored by the designer for what the river is going to do. So the designer is able to specify any number of cluster types, in this case an A type and a B type, and assign dimensions to them, you know, within a probability range. So, you know, these A clusters might be from 50 to 60 in width and from 100 to 120 in length, and the B clusters are slightly wider and a little bit longer. And then the designer is able to specify a pattern, AAB. So we're just going to build out the layout by putting an A cluster, an A cluster, a B cluster, AAB, AAB. And it will run that out for the entire length of that biome. And then we'll move into the next biome, and that pattern may change, as might the sort of the types of sections that we define. So in this case, we have a a B section added, which acts as a little bit of a transition between the A and the C. Very, very simple. Now, dimensions are not the only thing that designers can specify in each river section. They can also specify island density, desired visitable location count. They can control whether rapids are allowed to appear. In fact, they can specify whether rapids are not allowed to appear, forced to appear, or sort of auto-detect whether rapids should be there, which is the default sort of state. And then also specify, for example, a scale on the flow speed so that certain sections can be faster than others. And so by using those parameters, we kind of settled on what is basically the fundamental structure of the island, which is of the river, which is basically a series of long, narrow corridors with fast flow speed, leading into wide open, slower moving clusters of islands where the player is allowed to make choices about where to dock, coming back into narrow corridors and onto the next island cluster. So that's sort of the ebb and flow of the maybe 15-minute to half-hour gameplay of the entire game, and all of our biomes kind of follow that pattern. I hesitate to call it an AI director, because in my mind, an AI director controls that pacing as a reaction to things that the player is doing. So it's more a reactive thing. This is not reactive at all to what the player is doing. So it's not an AI director exactly, but I do think it sort of fills the same sort of functional slot as an AI director does. So let's move on to composition now. I kind of went back and forth on what to call this stage, but. So in composition, we just decide, okay, now for one of those individual river sections, what are we going to put inside it? What are we going to spawn there? And there's really two kinds of things we spawn there. One is just general landmass, like islands and river edges. So we're going to be placing the edges of the river as well, finding out where to put them. And we also put the resource locations, so the special locations that the player can dock at. So just starting with the general landmasses, for a given biome, we have kind of a library of islands, and we divide up those islands into a couple of different size categories. And then we combine those with the desired density that was specified by the designer for that section. And then we run it through a histogram, which basically says what is the balance of extra large to medium to small islands that we want to see inside of that section. So with a fairly balanced, hopefully you can see that. But with a fairly balanced histogram like that, you get a sort of a pleasing balance of large and small islands, sort of all intermixed. With a very sort of small, heavy histogram, you get a bunch of tiny little islands, and with a extra large, heavy histogram, you get just a few small islands. Now note that the density is actually in terms of landmass per kilometer squared, not in terms of islands per kilometer squared. And that's just because we can't decide first that we're going to place 50 islands and then decide that all 50 islands are going to be extra large. So all three of these different configurations on the right are the same density. So they should represent the same total land mass. It just means that if you place an extra large island, you place less of them. It's fairly straightforward. Now on to the resource locations. These are the landmarks that the player is going to recognize. They're going to float down the river and say, oh, there's a church, and they're going to learn over the course of playing the game and dying many times that churches provide these kinds of resources, gas stations, these other kinds of resources, and so on. So balancing the appearance of those resource locations is a big deal. We want to have good control over that from a design balance perspective. Generally, we're going to have maybe 3 to 5 of them per river section, depending on the size of the river section. And we're certainly only going to have one of each type in each river section. So you're never going to come to a section and see 2 churches there. You're only going to get 1 church. So we could do a very, very simple thing, which is just say, hey, every time we're sort of composing a new river section, let's say that there's a certain chance that, that a church will appear, P church. Now the nice thing about that is that, you know, the probability works out such that if my probability of spawning is P church, then 1 over P church is the expected interval, the average interval between churches. So if my chance of spawning a church is 0.25, then on average I'll see a church every 4 sections, which is about right for us. The only problem with that scheme is that the max interval is infinity. I could get really unlucky and never see a church. And of course that will provide a horrible experience for the player because they won't be able to get certain needed resources, and those kinds of streaks of bad luck happen all the time. So instead what we do is we take more of a scheduling approach in which the designers for each resource location type get to specify a minimum, an average, and a maximum interval of appearance. So that lets us basically say a church will appear every about 2 to 3 sections, but never more than 5. So by the time I get to the 5th section, if I haven't seen a church yet, my probability of spawning it is 1. So there's a bunch of ways that you could arrange that. This is not what we did. It's what I probably should have done. If I were going to do it again, I would have done this. I would have just sampled a triangular distribution. It's a very, very simple probability distribution. And so you would just keep track of when was the last time. Well, basically, like each time you spawn a church, say, you would sample one of these distributions, and that would tell you when the next one should appear. So you've just placed a church, now place the next one in 3 sections. We did something much more complicated for not a lot of benefit, I would say. Learn from my terrible mistakes. And just to note that this is the way that almost all the resources in the game are scheduled, including, you know, what plants appear on the individual Explorer Islands, what kind of loot we spawn, what kind of enemy NPCs get spawned on the different islands, and so on. So now we get to the meaty center of the talk, which is optimization. Composition has given us a list of assets that we want to spawn into a river section, and now we want to just actually find their final locations. We want to put them where they belong. The islands are, for the most part, very irregularly shaped. They're meant to look organic, and yet generic, so that we can make a lot of get a lot of variation out of using the same islands over and over again at different orientations and that kind of thing. And so the challenge is to sort of make all these islands fit together in a pleasing looking way, make them look organic, make sure that the boundaries the boundaries between sections don't, you know, look too terrible. And I guess most elusively of all, we want to create a sense of place when possible. And I have some idea, you know, some vague thoughts on what that means in a little while. So here's how optimization works. You start with some kind of best guess for where everything should go. You evaluate the state of that state of the world using an objective function. An objective function is just something that takes in your state and gives you a number. And that number, 4.5 or 9.7. And that number either represents how good things are or how bad things are, depending on how you're doing it. And then you sort of iteratively modify that state to either increase the goodness or decrease the badness. So we use a scheme called gradient descent, and add another scheme on top of that for the best as I can figure out, I think random restarts is sort of a fair term for that. I couldn't find exactly whether what we're doing has a name, but I'll call it gradient descent with random restarts. So in terms of a best guess start for all these things, we are placing river edges, so we can always sort of place the river edges along the river section geometry where we sort of suspect they're probably going to end up. We actually end up doing something kind of sneaky. We place resource locations in pairs along the length of the river section, and the point of that is to try and create as many situations where 2 different resource locations are going to be on opposite sides of the river so that the player can't visit both of them at once. Our worst case scenario is you enter into a river section and everything is lined up in a line. And that's not interesting because the player is not forced to make any interesting decisions. Sid Meier is on my shoulder here saying, interesting decisions. So, and then the rest, which are all the just random islands, are just distributed completely randomly. So our objective function is in fact an error function, so we are going to be doing a gradient descent, not a gradient ascent. Our state is simply the x, y, and theta, the x, y, and rotation of every island in the scene, in the section. And we're basically just going to generate an error value that penalizes the violation of certain constraints that we want observed. For example, we want the river edges to match as much as possible the underlying river section geometry. So there's an error term that penalizes, that gets bigger as those river edges get pushed away from the edges of the underlying river section. We want shorelines to stitch together correctly. So if they pull apart too much, we want to penalize that. But then the most important one is we don't want islands to overlap. So as islands do overlap, as islands do come too close together, that generates an error term as well. Now, the nice thing with what error function is that it's all summable, so I can break up those different constraints into individual terms and evaluate each term completely independently. Of course, I could architect those terms to in a not smart way and have them cancel each other out or do something silly like that, but for the most part, that's not an issue. So let's talk about overlap error, because it's sort of the easiest to explain, and you'll understand how to do the rest when we explain this. How do we penalize the overlap between two islands? Or I would say the total overlap in the entire scene. Well, we take these arbitrarily shaped islands, and our environment artist, Chad Leclerc, who's sitting over there, put some spheres on it. We call these packing spheres. And that's just so that we can deal with a construct or a series of constructs that's a lot more easily dealt with mathematically than an arbitrary polygon. So they don't have to be super accurate, but they have to capture the overall shape of each island. And then once we have that, it's very easy to say, well, given these two islands and given their size, I want these two islands to have a given desired margin between them. So you can very quickly see that we can calculate a sphere-to-sphere overlap error, basically just a function of how much too close are these two spheres. And just as we broke up the error function into a series of terms for each constraint, we break up the overlap into a series of terms for each island. So once you are able to calculate sphere-to-sphere error, clearly the island-to-island error for each pair of islands is just the sum of all the individual sphere errors, and my total overlap error is just add up all the sphere-to-sphere interactions. And there you go. Very easy. Because we know how to figure out the distance between two spheres, as it turns out. So if you want to make it look a little more mathy, we say, well, just add up the radius of A plus the radius of B plus the desired margin. That kind of represents how far we want to be. And then the actual distance between the spheres is how far we actually are. Now that overlap is calculated such that if the two spheres are as far apart as desired or farther, we get a 0 or negative overlap value. And only as they get closer does the overlap become positive. And that's just so that we can run it through an error function like overlap squared, essentially, which is, if you've ever done any optimization or anything like that, like the square of the error is always like the most default error function to use. We've tried actually a couple of different error functions here, not just d squared, and you could actually use anything as long as, well, first of all, as long as it's 0, the error is 0 on the left half of the x-axis, and as long as it's monotonically increasing, and as long as it's differentiable, as we're going to see. So for gradient descent, we now have our state, we have our error function, and what we need to calculate then is a gradient. So we take a whole bunch of partial derivatives. And that looks super, super ugly, but in fact, just as we broke up error to be just a sphere-to-sphere calculation, the gradient also can be calculated, broken all the way down. It's also summable, so you can also break it all the way down to an individual sphere and just calculate for each sphere-on-sphere interaction what is its own contribution to the gradient. And you add them all up, and you get a gradient. And then we do a very standard gradient descent step, where we step basically in the negative gradient direction. Now, if people are don't know what a gradient is and don't know what the hell gradient descent is, it's actually conceptually very simple. I have an island. It's at an xy position at a certain angle, theta. What the gradient tells me is what direction should I move that island in order to most quickly decrease the amount of error. So the gradient tells me essentially this island should start heading in this direction and start rotating this way. And so it doesn't tell us how far to go. It just tells us that this is the direction that decreases the error. And so we can at that point step in that direction and see what happened to the error. If we go too far, maybe the error will actually be bigger, but in any case, it gives us a good hint on where to go. So the tough part in all of this is in actually calculating those partial derivatives. And in the interest of keeping this going, I put that into an appendix, so you'll be able to get these slides afterwards and take a look at the horrific math if you'd like, if you're that kind of person. Suffice it to say, it's a partial derivative. It's a couple applications of the chain rule. Freshman year of college math stuff. I know what you're thinking. You're thinking, shut your damn mouth and show me a video. So here's the action. Here's the sort of system in action. So the jiggling that you see back and forth is us kind of searching through, basically following the gradient and sort of finding these little valleys of error. And you can see that as each section spawns in, it's initially random, but very quickly the islands kind of settle and find their place. Now, I noted earlier that this represents, that overlap error is just one of the constraints that we're imposing in the error function. So the other constraints that you're seeing right now are, for example, the shore linking constraints, which is keeping the individual river edge pieces from pulling apart too much. So if the river edge pieces kind of feel like they're on a series of hinges, that's because that error is keeping them from floating apart too far. You also might have noticed that there's some jiggling. Sometimes it settles and then it sort of restarts again and then resettles. That's sort of the random restart mechanism that I'm going to talk about in a minute. So on the left is like one of our very early sort of reference river sections that Chad put together. So in the early days, we did call this system the AutoChad. And then on the right is an example that I captured yesterday of what a river section looks like once gone through the optimization phase. I mean, it's not exactly comparable because the density on the right is a little bit higher than the density on the left and so on. But there's a lot of stuff that I like. You can really see how the irregular shapes are kind of like complementing each other. They're kind of fitting in together. It's almost like loose puzzle pieces. That to me is sort of what makes the system fairly successful and makes it feel organic. It kind of feels like these island pieces settle together a little bit and they feel right. I wish I had an objective like success metric. Oh yes, this is correct. I don't think we have a metric other than like, yeah, it feels good. Nor is it very useful looking at real-world reference, by the way. Like, rivers don't really have islands, and if they have islands, they're really uninteresting islands. So this is much better than real life. There's another example of a long section of river. So one of the big problems with gradient descent in general, as you will know if you've ever done it, is that it's very easy to get caught in these local minima. In other words, we follow the error landscape downhill, and we get to a bowl in which there's no way locally to decrease the error. And if that bowl is low enough in error, if it by constraints are more or less, you know, satisfied, then yeah, that's fine. Maybe I just accept that. But local minima can have this really rather catastrophic effect for our players. They can create things like river blockages, where all of a sudden you just run out of river, which is pretty frustrating experience. So there's a whole bunch of optimization techniques that basically use some amount of randomness to get around this. Simulated annealing is a good example, where simulated annealing will, with great frequency, randomly choose a new state based on an old state, and even if that state has higher error, it will jump to it anyway, because you know, maybe it's better overall to go in that direction. It's kind of amazing that it works at all, but we kind of take a we take a kind of cue from that by adding a certain amount of randomness. And the way that we do that is that, in addition to calculating overall error, we also calculate something we call critical error. That is, if two spheres are far too close together, you know, say 70% too close together, then we register that as critical error and register the island as being engaged in some kind of critical overlap. And then we run all the way through gradient descent. We get to the end and we say, oh, we have these islands that are still in a critical error state. And just those islands, we randomize. We just replace them somewhere else in the map. And then we run gradient descent again. And we do that a couple of times. And usually there's no critical error at all. I would say 50% of the time there's no error at all. I would say another 40% of the time, after the first or second run through, the critical error is gone. If by like the fourth run through we still have critical error, then we just start deleting islands, particularly if they're non-visitable islands. It's kind of cool. You can actually graph this and see exactly what's happening. The yellow line is the error, and the red line is the critical error. So you can see how we run to about 80 iterations. I think 80 is our maximum iteration step. We have too much critical error, and so we randomize, and we suddenly get a big error spike, but then it settles again, and then by the fourth time, it has found an acceptable state. I had never actually done the graphing of this, so when I did that specifically for this talk, I was very pleased that it was such a clear trend line. Rarely does theory match reality, but it did by some miracle. So here's an example. I mean, here's a river section that is far too dense for the size. I cranked the density way up, so there's really no way that it should be able to spawn these, to fit them all. But you can see it just sort of searching for different configurations, and then it just gives up and deletes a bunch of stuff. Obviously, the player doesn't see this. Like, if the player were able to move the camera up, they would not see the islands jiggling around in front of them. But you know, it's a cool visualization to actually see what's going on, and obviously very useful to debug stuff. Okay, so let's talk about flow generation. We've now got our river section. We've decided where all the islands are going to be, and now we want to generate the flow of the water around the different islands. So obviously, we're interested in doing this to sort of support the interesting fiction that we're on a river. It is great because it makes navigation challenging. It gives actually a way in which the player can get better at navigating the river as they learn to sort of read where the flow is going and understand how to sort of slingshot around islands and that kind of thing. So it's a neat feature. But that being said, we're not super interested in creating like really super realistic flows. I like the next programmer nerd. I love like Navier-Stokes simulations and watching like fluid smoke sim and that kind of stuff. But there's a lot of strange effects to that. There's a lot of turbulence, there's a lot of eddies and stuff, and that kind of stuff is not generally going to be readable by the player, nor can we necessarily afford a sort of ongoing simulation at the sort of resolution that we would need. So what we're really looking for is sort of some kind of cartoon fluid dynamics solution, and one that is static, one that we just calculate the flow and then we're done, and then we just query it. So like a lot of things, like the other steps, we place a series of angled bounding boxes over the river. We call these flow volumes, and for each of those flow volumes, we will run a fluid solution, a flow solution on there, and then we'll line up the next box and do it again. And between those boxes, we'll basically blend flow angles and do silly stuff like that. So the output of all this is going to be a flow map. That's basically just a 2D grid of vectors where I ask for a cell, and the cell gives me back a flow velocity at that point. And so it's basically like a texture. And in fact, that will be used as a texture when we pass it down to the water rendering. And then, of course, at runtime, we can also do some like simple bilinear interpolation stuff to blend between those different cells. So I was really worried about time on this talk, and I had a whole bunch of slides here culminating the demo. And then I thought, well, forget it. Why don't we just go to the demo, and I'll explain it there. So let's see. Can everyone see that? More or less, it's a little dark. I apologize for that. This is, I shipped a game before this called Third Eye Crime, and it was a 2D game, and I built my own engine for it. It was a fantastic experience that I recommend no one ever do. But in moving on to The Flame and the Flood, I continued to use the engine that I had built for a lot of different kinds of prototyping. So I did a lot of the NPC prototyping originally in Sputnik. Sputnik is the name of this engine. And I also did a lot of the flow stuff. So here's an example of a river section. Obviously, the first step in creating this representation is to sort of rasterize the environment in some case. We just, in some way, we just take the environment as it exists in the river section, and we turn it into a grid of cells, and each cell is either empty or it's solid space. So empty space, water can flow through. And then we also specify those the blue and the red lines at the edges are the input and output. So we're flowing from left to right here. We're going to be. So there's a, before we actually calculate the flow directly, there's an important intermediate step, which is called, which we call an isomap. I'll show you an isomap, God willing. There it is. So an isomap is actually like very much like a topographic map. In a topographic map, there's a bunch of lines, and those lines represent constant altitude. So if I were to walk along a line, then I would remain at the same altitude as I walked around hills and mountains and that kind of thing. Well, very similar here, except a line of constant value in the isomap represents a line of flow. Okay, so if I would just say like, well, let's take the easiest example. This is full red down here. If I just move from one full red to another full red, I'll move along the, can you see my, oh yeah, you can't see my cursor. I'll just move along the bottom shoreline. Similarly up here, and if I take half red, I'll move again, you know, basically through some line of flow. And in fact, I can sort of place down some things. I'm kind of cheating. I mean, I'm talking about the ISO map, and I haven't told you yet how we actually calculate a vector out of that, a flow vector, but in any case. So the very, I'm almost embarrassed at how dumb this is, but all we're going to do, so it's easy to do this when you have a section of river and no islands in it. You basically, using an algorithm called Dijkstra's, everyone who saw my talk at the AI Summit knows that I love Dijkstra's. Dijkstra's is an algorithm where I can create a distance map. So I can say, in this case, create a map which tells me for every single point on this open space here, how far am I from the right shoreline? And I can create a different map that tells me how far am I from the left shoreline. And combining those values, I can make an ISO value that varies smoothly between those two shorelines. So literally, we have a value that is 0 here and 1 here. It's pretty easy. Expensive, but easy. And then, so when we then want to add islands in, so what I can do is just come in here and draw an island, like this. I can recalculate. What the island is going to do is just basically distort the underlying ISO map and basically stitch itself into the ISO map. And the very simple way that we do that is that we pick a point on the island. Let's say, well, anyway. We pick a point on the island that's going to represent the break point, the point at which the flow moves either left or right. We're going to pick a point on that island, and we're going to look at what the ISO value is. And what we can say at that point, say the ISO value is 0.6. What we can say at that point is that the entire perimeter of this island in the ISO map is going to be 0.6. We're going to just force it to be 0.6 all the way around. And that's so that, again, a line of flow comes up to the center of the island, is going to break around both sides, and then continue. And then we take that 0.6 and we just fade it out. So we literally just take an ISO value and we blend it out over some margin. And that's all it is. And that's how these islands are stitching themselves in. Hopefully that makes some amount of sense. Those slides that I took out, which explain this a little more visually, those again will be on the slides if you want to look up the slides later. So now, how do we actually take it from an ISO map to an actual flow vector? Well, we actually use the gradient again. We calculate a gradient for every single little point here. And the gradient, again, tells us what direction do I have to move in to increase the ISO value. Okay, and that gives me up here, it gives me a direction, say, straight towards one shore. And then at that point, we literally just rotate it 90 degrees to the right, and that gives us our flow vector. So I can actually show you the flow vector now. Let's see. Yeah, so that's what the flow vector ends up looking like. If I run this, I think these are mapped to red and blue, the red and blue channels. So red, a positive red value is going to the right, and then blue is, the amount of blue is telling me how much vertically I'm moving. So you can just see that if I put a little piece of debris right there, it goes down. If I put a little piece of debris up there, it goes up, and it all just kind of flows together. Actually, it's more compelling at like 10 times speed. So there we go. We do a couple of other, I think, cool things at this stage as well. I mentioned rapids numerous times, and we kind of treat rapids as a feature detection problem. So I can turn on, for example, rapids that I have discovered. Wow, that's a pretty extreme rapid. It's pretty thick, but the bright green area basically what that feature detector is doing is looking for narrow channels and having found one, seeing how long the channel is, and then marking all of that as rapids area. So I can, let's see, I'm just going to try and take away one of those islands. So it's kind of nice to be able to edit these things on the fly and just see what the reaction is. So, you know, as I move things around, it tells me where the rapids would go. And then the last thing that we also do here is we sort of look for splash zones. So basically, areas where, areas where it'd be interesting to put like splash effects and that kind of thing. Let's see. Yeah, so the little white areas are basically showing me where the river, the flow is coming up against an island, and the little, I don't know if you can see the little dots, but the little dots are suggested locations for actual effects placement. So placing splash effects and that kind of thing. Anyway, that's a very quick view of that. Hopefully that made a tiny amount of sense. So very quickly go on to sort of the rendering and decoration phase. We now have our flow calculated. We have all the islands where they belong. And we have to do a couple of things here to sort of prepare the scene for final viewing by the player. One is we're going to do some simple, you know, randomization on the islands themselves. Like a lot of the islands have a couple of random variants that it can switch between and try and make a little more mileage out of like the same pieces of geometry. You know, spawn a billboard here, or don't next time spawn some kind of rock feature there or not, that kind of thing. So a little bit of that goes on. We place effects, kind of including the splash effects that I just alluded to in the fluid sim, light shafts, and for creating dramatic god rays, and water streamers, these big water worms that sort of flow, and they're actually quite important for us because they actually are yet another cue that the player can use to read where the river is going. And in fact, we purposely place a lot of those water streamer effects at the breakpoints of the islands to try and emphasize what point do I have to aim towards to sort of flow around the left side versus the right side. So we try to accentuate that breakpoint as much as possible. And then, of course, we generate the water geometry itself. It's just a very highly tessellated mesh that sort of follows the river layout. And you know, we add some undulation in the vertex shader. And then we do the water shader itself. I'm not going to talk at all about the water shader, only because what we did is not particularly new. In fact, we basically exactly did what the Portal 2 guys did. So they wrote a great presentation for SIGGRAPH 2010, which you'll see referenced everywhere. But we did exactly the same thing, and it worked pretty well. So just a few quick words on how we get all this stuff to work together. Again, that's sort of the series of steps that we've gone through, and I kind of like pointing out that in some ways those different timescales of gameplay that I talked about early on actually kind of correspond to various stages in that pipeline. So performance is, of course, a big concern. Almost all of the steps that I went over, particularly the complicated ones, involve some kind of horrible n-cubed iteration over something, including Dijkstra's. Dijkstra's is not a super cheap process. So there's two fairly straightforward strategies that work absolutely fine for us. The first, of course, being parallelization. The flow generation in particular is, I think, really amenable to this because the input and the output are so well defined. Once you have rasterized your environment, you can just take that texture and boot it off to another process. including maybe including a processor maybe that doesn't even share memory with your main process. It's fairly well-defined little chunk of memory that you need to pass back and forth, and it's also a fairly well-defined chunk of memory that needs to pass back. So it was actually shockingly easy for us, fairly late in the game, to shuffle that process off to shuffle flow generation off to another thread. And then the other one is good old time slicing. We just simply say that we're only allowed to do one expensive thing every tick. And all of those different processes share the same time slice. And so a tick on which composition, for example, is spawning some number of islands, in that same tick, gradient descent will not be allowed to run. And gradient descent will run each tick. Gradient descent, if it is holding the time slice right now, it will run one iteration of the gradient descent and no more. And that's it's actually sort of, once you get that handoff correct, it works really well. We did have some performance issues on the Xbox One in particular, fairly late in the game, but that was some of what prompted us to move flow generation in particular off to the other thread. Now, the other complication of all this is that in that pipeline, each stage of the pipeline is passing data onto the next one. Flow generation can't run until optimization is completely finished. Just as the water rendering cannot happen until flow generation has happened. So we do have kind of a staging concern that we have to figure out. And again, it's not that complicated. What we say is that there is some maximum distance at which we want to start composing and optimizing the river. So say at maybe 5 kilometers, we want to, if we get to a river section, within 5 kilometers of a river section, we want to ask that river section to start placing islands and optimizing them. So we have some desired range. But then we also have a range at which we say, well, if you haven't finished, we're just going to straight up block until you finish. Literally, the player will, the screen will freeze. The player will say, "What, is this game broken?" And then it will suddenly go on again. So it doesn't usually happen, but it is a very hard constraint that says we have to be done with the optimization phase by the time the player gets within, in this case, 3 kilometers of a river section. And there's a very similar thing for flow generation. We start trying to grab the time slice to generate flow at about 3 kilometers, and we will straight up block on it until if we get to 1 kilometer. And that's just so that we can be ready with all the water surface generation and decoration by the time it comes anywhere near the visual frustum, within the visual field of the player. I'm doing better on time than I thought I would. So we're kind of at the end. That's the overview. There's a lot of details, of course, that I kind of skipped over, but I'm of course happy to answer any questions about details you might have. And again, I'm going to put the slides online so that you can, if you want to look at them in more detail, including some of the ugly math. So clearly, PCG is a big deal these days. This was really, for me, I had never done PCG in any form at all before, and this was like a really cool opportunity to do that, particularly for a sort of element of the game that was so central to every second of the player's experience. At the same time, I do realize that The Flame and the Flood is kind of this, it's a little bit of a unique case because it has this sort of linear, unidirectional structure for the entire game. And there are certain techniques, like the scheduling techniques and the sequence techniques of the layout, that that it's hard to see exactly how they would apply to, say, a procedural landscape or something like that. So in other words, we're sort of less this and more this. So the takeaways, I would say, come in two flavors. There's sort of the technical takeaways. Again, sort of, I think the way that we did schedule and histogram-based spawning is pretty useful, and certainly like the use of gradient descents to optimize some pre-made pieces, I think is interesting and probably very applicable to other kinds of games, and including non-river games. And you know, if you are making something with flow in it, then you know, maybe the cartoon fluid dynamics model will be useful to you. But I think there's also maybe an architectural thing here, which I'd love to have more conversations with people who have also done sort of PCG pipelines. I feel like the layout, composition, optimization, and decoration pipeline is actually something that is probably fairly generalizable. A phase in which we sort of plan out the overall shape of things, a composition phase in which we decide how individual pieces of that layout will be structured, or what it will contain, on optimization, which you know, finds an actual configuration for all those elements, and then a decoration and case stage in which everything is prepared for player viewing. So so let's make it happen. We'll call it the LCOD architecture. It's very interesting to Google image search for COD because you get a bunch of pictures of fish interspersed with screenshots of Call of Duty. So that's what I got. Please contact me if you are interested, if you have questions offline. The slides will be very soon at my website right there. And I think we have maybe 4 minutes for questions. It's a miracle. Thank you.
Yeah, I was just wondering how you handled the seams between your river sections. It seems like if you erred too far on keeping things away from there, you would get kind of gaps in content. And was that just something you dealt with, or? You mean for the? So the question was how do we deal with the transitions between different river sections? Exactly. And I kind of want to make it look like there is no seam, but. Yeah. So. In particular, the transition between maybe more narrow sections and wider open sections, sure. So mitigating or like navigating, like particularly the optimization phase, if I'm understanding. I believe so, yeah. Yeah. Thank you very much for that question, because I had a whole bunch of slides on that, and I thought I was not going to get time to do it. We actually do a thing where when we do optimization for a river section, we actually allow that river section to adopt some number of the islands of the previous section. So basically, if I'm a wide open section, I'll actually be able to grab the islands that have already been placed and sort of reactivate them and run with run the optimization phase with those included in the calculation. And what that does is it allows those river pieces to sort of, it actually rather well smooths out the transition so that everything kind of, you know, pulls together in a certain way. I wish I could have the slide somewhere, but yes. So each time we generate a whole bunch of new islands, we also adopt from the previous section some number of islands, and that's how we run, and that solves the problem pretty much. Thank you.
Hey, Damian.
Hey.
So you've got designers who say, okay, I want a feature to happen if I haven't seen it in 5 sections. The probability of that feature is 1. And you've also got a hard limit on there's only one of those features per section. Mm-hmm. So how do you handle or prevent a probability of 1 for more than one feature in a given section?
Well, you can. I mean, you can. I mean, it just means that, you know, again, like there are 3 to 5 of these visible locations per section. So if it, you know, we're going to spawn a church and a gas station, then fine. Maybe they both had probably as 1. But I think you're touching on a really good question, which I don't have a good answer for, which is, say I've specified I can have maximum 5 locations here, and all 7 locations say, oh, now I have to spawn. Well, what can you do? You only spawn 5 of them, and you tell 2 of them, well, you're going to have to wait till next section. So it's absolutely true that in theory, the average interval is reflected by the spawning frequencies, but every once in a while there'll be a collision of so many that you have to
So the effective average interval is probably a little bit longer than the desired, but it don't matter.
Great talk, inspiring stuff. I was surprised that you were using Dijkstra for doing the distance map. Wouldn't it have been much easier to simply generate implicit functions of the...
Generate what you said?
Implicit functions of the course edges of the river? Because then you would have an immediate formula for computing the distance to the...
An implicit function of... sorry, but you mean based on the packing spheres or something like that?
Well, you can make a course layout of edges of the coast and then use those edges to compute.
Sure, yeah, that's true.
It's awfully brute force.
It is, yeah, and I'm a completely irrational fan of Dijkstra's, so I use it everywhere. Yeah, if I could, it's true, and actually one of the ways I think in which the river edge will the flow is going to be improved in later iterations is actually to do some of the simplification of the river, of the shoreline that maybe you're alluding to. So yeah, I mean such an implicit representation, of course, would not handle cases where there are concavities in one shoreline or another. But you're right. I mean that might be a faster.
Just take the edges of.
Yeah. That's a good optimization.
Thanks.
Yeah. Thanks.
Fantastic talk. Really, really interesting. So
thank you.
So much. This is kind of slightly more of a design query, but when you're talking about the kind of the infinite randomness that technically a church could never spawn, there's obviously a big problem for a lot of designers, and you do want to kind of curate that experience. But did you find one of the elements of roguelikes can be that kind of play a story element where you did get 10 floors without a health pickup, and that was kind of almost more interesting because it was like, it's that 1 in a million chance where the really, really bad thing happened, but that's more of a story to tell. Was there kind of an inside kind of decision made from the design point of, is it worth giving that up to get a more curated, more kind of balanced experience, but with less of those super highs and super lows where really crazy things happen?
I mean, it's a great question. Like, so the question was like, is it worth creating bounds on those spawning frequencies, because when you do get a really bad run, it can have story value to the player. I would say that, like, players don't often have a lot of sense of humor about like not getting their flint. They want their fucking flint. So I don't mind such a thing. I feel like the possibility for such streaks of bad luck should at least be consciously authored by design. And I think we can say things like, well, in the end, churches are not 100% required to play the game. So maybe we make church be one of those things, a church that be one of those things that can, maybe you'll never get one. But I will say that this approach is one that we happened upon because people were finding it frustrating that they would just go, they'd have one run. It's a problem when, especially for this kind of game, where we're trying to teach the player certain things about resources and and about the beginning of the game, right? Where you come to learn these strategies like, well, when I'm out of the gate, first thing I need is to expand my pouch, which requires me to get these kinds of resources. And you want the player to learn that, but then it becomes like really frustrating and crappy if, like, on a particular run, no, sorry, there's no pouches for you, just because. So yeah, I would say if there are going to be such streaks of bad luck, I would prefer that they be sort of consciously designed in rather than well, everything's random.
No, thank you very much.
With the random island rotation, how do you handle lighting?
With the random, sorry, say it again.
With the random island rotation, how do you handle lighting?
Lighting? It's all, I mean, it's all, we don't have any pre-baked lighting or anything. It's all dynamic lighting, so it's not at all an issue. There are certain elements on the islands, like billboards, that we actually do like rotate towards the camera once that's part of the decoration phase that I didn't talk about. But if you took the authored island and you just like rotated it 90 degrees, you would probably get a lot of like billboards like this. So we rotate those back as part of the decoration phase. But lighting itself was not an issue because it's all dynamic.
Great talk. I'm the guy you want to talk to. I do a game that's called The Long Journey Home, which is in space, and we do procedurally generated. And
nice.
we have so I took a lot of that, and actually I was smiling a lot about your how you done things. So we should talk afterwards. But my question is, how long did you iterate and change and rewrite the whole thing when you came up with the events and all that? So we figured out for us it was like really a long time. We worked all on AAA bigger projects, and doing that was really astonishing how long we took for pre-production because we changed and then tried to figure out all that stuff. So how long did it take until you had the feeling, oh, now we have it, now it's working, now we can throw content, or you don't want to throw so much content on it, but you get the idea, I think.
Yeah, so the question is, like, how long was it before this system was, like, at least basically in place before we could, before we had confidence that, like, okay, there's a game here and we can hang it around this structure. I mean, I would say actually, like, it was fairly fast. I mean, it was, we started together as a company around May, June of 2014, and then we, had all of this in place certainly by the time we did our Kickstarter in October. But even given that time frame, I wasn't working on that full time by any means. So it was probably, I would say, an initial probably 2 months of, like, getting things to basically work. And of course it wasn't.
Yeah, the basic one, I agree, but we figured out we also had very fast the basic stuff, and then you're figuring out it's really the tiny gritty things.
Yes.
Where you really have to find very smart solutions.
Totally. I mean, I think we had the basic framework for the solution after about 2 months. And we were certainly confident enough to go forward with it at that point. And then, a week here and a week there and 2 weeks here and 2 weeks there, that clearly adds up. But that was much more of a, long-term iteration spread out between other things.
I think we have to leave. It would be cool if we could continue.
Please, yeah. Okay, I'm all done. Thank you, everybody.